In the spring of 1887, in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a 60-year-old woman named Margaret Whitmore did something no one expected. After decades of loneliness, she decided to buy 3 orphan children at a human auction. What she didn't know was that one of these children carried a secret that would change her life forever. Margaret had lost her husband 15 years earlier in a railroad accident. Since then, she had lived alone in her 2-story house on Main Street, surrounded only by memories and the silent routine of a life without purpose. Her gray hair always pulled back in a tight bun, her hands calloused from housework, and her blue eyes that once sparkled with joy now carried only the melancholy of someone who had lost everything she loved. If stories like this move you as much as they move us, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Here, every detail matters, and this story will surprise you in a way you never imagined. During that era, orphan auctions were a cruel but common reality in American towns. Children who had been abandoned or whose parents had died were literally sold to families who needed cheap labor. The orphan train movement had scattered thousands of children across the country, and many of them ended up in situations that ranged from salvation to disguised slavery. Margaret had her reasons for being there. It wasn't cruelty, but rather a mixture of desperate loneliness and a maternal instinct that had never been satisfied. She and her husband, Thomas, had tried to have children for years, but nature hadn't been generous with them. Now, at 60 years old, with an empty house and sufficient financial resources, she decided it was time to do something that would give meaning to her existence. The auction took place in front of the Cedar Falls courthouse on a cold March morning. The sky was gray, and a cutting wind blew between the town's wooden buildings. Margaret arrived early, wearing her best black dress, the same one she wore to church on Sundays, and carrying a leather purse with her savings. The auctioneer, a fat man named Harold Brennan, organized the children in a line. There were about 20 of them, aged between 5 and 15 years old. Some cried silently, others looked at the crowd with a mixture of fear and hope. But 3 children immediately caught Margaret's attention. They were at the end of the line, and each one had a burlap sack completely covering their head. The coarse fabric came down to their shoulders, with small holes to breathe through. Margaret was perplexed. Why did these children have sacks over their heads? She asked the auctioneer, who answered with indifference. Those 3 have special issues, facial deformities, accidents, things that might frighten buyers. But they're hard workers, I guarantee it. Margaret felt something twist in her stomach. It wasn't disgust. It was indignation. How could they treat children this way? She watched the 3 small bodies trembling with cold and fear, and a fierce determination took hold of her. The other children were sold one by one. A farmer bought 2 boys to work the harvest. A town family took a blonde-haired girl. Margaret waited patiently, but her attention never strayed from the 3 hooded children. When it was finally their turn, the auctioneer didn't even bother to make a proper presentation. 3 orphans, approximate ages between 8 and 12 years old. Special conditions, as you can see. Who'll make a bid? The crowd fell silent. Some people whispered among themselves, others looked away. Margaret could feel the embarrassment and rejection in the air, like a toxic fog that suffocated any trace of humanity. That's when she stood up. "I'll take all three," she said with a firm voice that echoed across the square. "How much?" The auctioneer seemed surprised. "Ma'am, are you sure? They might have serious problems. We don't know exactly what." "I said I'll take all three," Margaret interrupted, her voice even more determined. "How much?" "Well, normally it would be $15 each, but considering the circumstances, I'll accept $30 for all three." Margaret opened her purse and counted the coins. $30 was a lot of money in those days, equivalent to almost 2 months' wages for a common worker. But she didn't hesitate. She put the money in the auctioneer's hand and walked toward the 3 children. "Come with me," she said softly, extending her hand. "You're going home now." The children hesitated for a moment. Margaret could see, through the holes in the sacks, small eyes shining with tears. Slowly, the smallest one, who appeared to be about 8 years old, extended a dirty little hand and took Margaret's hand. The walk to the house was silent. Margaret walked slowly, allowing the children to get used to her. She could feel the curious stares of neighbors through windows, but she didn't care. Her mind was focused on one thing: giving these children something they clearly never had: dignity. When they reached home, Margaret took them directly to the kitchen. The house smelled of cinnamon and waxed wood. It was a welcoming place, with well-maintained furniture and lace curtains on the windows. The children stood in the middle of the kitchen, still with the sacks on their heads, not knowing what to do. "Sit at the table," Margaret said gently. "I'll prepare something for you to eat." She heated chicken soup and cut thick slices of homemade bread. She placed 3 steaming bowls on the table and said, "Now you can take off those sacks. Here in this house, nobody needs to hide." There was a moment of hesitation. Margaret could feel their fear, the uncertainty of years of rejection and humiliation. But slowly, the smallest child began to lift the sack. What Margaret saw made her hold her breath. It was a boy of about 8 years old, with disheveled red hair and bright green eyes. But the left side of his face had a deep scar that went from his forehead to his chin, slightly deforming his mouth. Even so, when he smiled timidly, Margaret felt her heart melt. The second child was a girl of about 10 years old. When she removed the sack, she revealed a sweet face, but with a purple birthmark that covered almost the entire right half of her face. Her brown eyes were enormous and expressive, full of an intelligence that had been ignored because of her appearance. The third child, a boy of about 12 years old, took longer to uncover himself. When he finally removed the sack, Margaret understood why. He had a deformity on the left side of his face that made it look like his cheek had been pushed inward. But his blue eyes were identical to Margaret's. The same tone, the same depth. "What are your names?" Margaret asked softly. The smaller boy answered first. "I'm Billy, ma'am." The girl said, "I'm Sarah." And then the older boy spoke, with a voice that made Margaret feel as if the world had stopped. I'm Tommy Whitmore." Margaret became completely still. Whitmore was her and her husband's surname. But how was this possible? She had never had children. Or had she? Tommy Whitmore? She repeated, her voice trembling. Are you sure? The boy nodded, and then said something that made Margaret's blood freeze. My mother told me that my father was named Thomas Whitmore and that he worked for the railroad. She died when I was little, and since then I've been in orphanages. Margaret felt her legs weaken. She leaned on the table, trying to process what she was hearing. Thomas, her husband, had died 15 years ago. This boy was 12 years old. The math added up perfectly. Your mother, what was her name? Margaret asked, her voice almost a whisper. Catherine Miller. She worked at the tavern downtown. Margaret remembered her. Catherine was a young and beautiful woman who served drinks at the local tavern. Thomas used to stop there after work. Margaret had always suspected there was something between them, but never had the courage to confront him. Now, looking at the boy, she could see unmistakable traces of Thomas. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, even the way he tilted his head when he spoke. Despite the deformity, Tommy was clearly her husband's son. Margaret felt a mixture of conflicting emotions. Anger at having been betrayed, sadness at having lost so many years without knowing the grandson she never knew existed, and a strange sense of completeness, as if a missing piece of her life had finally been found. Tommy, she said, her voice full of contained emotion. Do you know that Thomas Whitmore was my husband? The boy's eyes widened. You're my grandmother? Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, my dear, I'm your grandmother. And you, she looked at Billy and Sarah, are my grandchildren too now. Tommy began to cry. It was a cry of relief, of years of abandonment and rejection finally coming to an end. Margaret pulled him into a tight hug, not caring about the soup spilling on the table. I looked for you, Tommy sobbed against her chest. When Mama died, I told everyone I had a grandmother, but nobody believed me. They said I was making it up. Margaret held the boy's deformed face between her hands. You'll never be alone again, Tommy. None of you will. This is your home now. Billy and Sarah watched the scene with a mixture of confusion and hope. Margaret realized they also needed comfort. Billy, Sarah, she said, extending her arms to them too. You're my grandchildren now too. Family isn't just about blood. It's about love and care. The three hugged, and Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years. Purpose. She had found her reason for living. In the following weeks, Margaret transformed her house and her life. She bought new clothes for the children, enrolled them in the local school, and faced the prejudiced stares of neighbors with fierce determination. When someone made comments about the children's appearance, she responded with a firmness that brooked no discussion. The transformation wasn't easy. Tommy, Billy, and Sarah carried deep traumas from years of rejection and mistreatment. Nightmares were common, and Margaret often spent entire nights awake, comforting a child who screamed in sleep or consoling another who cried silently. Tommy took the longest to adapt. At 12 years old, he had developed a hard shell to protect himself. He distrusted kindness, always expected to be rejected, and had difficulty believing that Margaret really wanted him there. He constantly tested her limits, expecting her to finally get tired and send him away. One night, about a month after they arrived, Margaret found Tommy trying to run away. She caught him at the kitchen door with a bundle of clothes in his hand. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked softly. "I know you're going to send me away," he replied without looking at her. "Everyone always does. It's better if I leave now, before you get tired of me." Margaret felt her heart break. She knelt in front of him, taking his face between her hands. "Tommy, listen to me carefully. You are my grandson, blood of my blood. There's nothing in this world that could make me send you away. Do you understand that?" Tommy began to cry. "But I'm ugly. People always say I'm ugly and scary." "You're not ugly," Margaret said firmly. "You're different, and different isn't ugly. You're my beautiful, intelligent, and brave grandson. And anyone who can't see that is the one with the problem, not you." She pulled him into a tight hug. "Besides, do you think I care about appearance? Look at me, Tommy. I'm a 60-year-old woman, with wrinkles, gray hair, and calloused hands. Beauty isn't about how you look. It's about who you are inside." From that night on, Tommy began to trust more. He still had his difficult moments, but slowly began to believe that maybe, finally, he had found a home. Billy, the 8-year-old boy with the scar on his face, was the most resilient of the three. Despite all the suffering, he maintained a contagious joy that lit up the house. He loved helping Margaret in the kitchen and had a natural talent for making people laugh. His scar, which initially frightened people, was soon forgotten by those who knew him, overshadowed by his brilliant personality. Sarah, the 10-year-old girl, was the quietest but also the most observant. She had a sharp intelligence that had been ignored because of her birthmark. Margaret discovered that she could read better than many older children and had an extraordinary memory. Under Margaret's loving care, Sarah began to flourish, showing a sweet personality and an insatiable curiosity about the world. School was another challenge. When Margaret took the 3 children to enroll, the principal, Mrs. Henderson, hesitated. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, looking uncomfortably at the children, "perhaps it would be better to consider homeschooling. Other children can be cruel." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "These children have the right to attend school like any other. And if there's a problem with cruelty, then it's something that needs to be addressed by the school, not avoided." The principal had no choice but to accept the children. Margaret made it clear that any form of discrimination would be faced by her personally. The first days were difficult. The other children really were cruel, as Mrs. Henderson had predicted. Tommy came home with a split lip after a fight. Billy was called Monster Face by a group of older boys. Sarah was ignored by the other girls, who whispered and pointed at her birthmark. But Margaret didn't give up. She visited the school regularly, talked with teachers and even with some children's parents. Slowly, with patience and determination, she began to change attitudes. The turning point came when Billy saved a younger child from drowning in the creek near the school. The boy who had always been called a monster risked his own life to save another. The story spread through the town, and for the first time, people began to see Margaret's children for who they really were, not for their appearance. Tommy proved to be an excellent student, especially in mathematics. His sharp intelligence and determination to prove his worth made him one of the best students in the class. Sarah became the teacher's favorite because of her thirst for knowledge and her ability to help other children with difficulties. At home, Margaret established routines that gave the children the stability they had never had. Family dinners, bedtime stories, prayers before sleep. She told stories about Thomas, helping Tommy get to know the father he never had the chance to meet. "Your father was a good man," she would say, "but he was also human. He made mistakes like all of us. But he would have loved you very much if he had known you." Margaret also began teaching the children practical skills. Tommy learned carpentry, Billy discovered a talent for cooking, and Sarah proved skilled with sewing. She wanted them to have means to support themselves when they grew up, but also wanted them to know they would always have a home with her. The town slowly began to accept the unusual family. Margaret, who had lived 15 years as a lonely widow, was now seen as a courageous woman who had done something extraordinary. The children, who had once been rejected for their appearance, began to be respected for their character. There were still medical challenges. Tommy needed surgery to improve his ability to chew due to the deformity. Billy developed vision problems related to his scar. Sarah began having headaches related to her birthmark. Margaret faced each problem with determination, spending her savings on doctors and treatments. 2 years after they arrived, the children were unrecognizable. Not physically, their differences were still there, but emotionally, they had transformed from frightened and rejected children into confident and loved young people. Tommy, now 14, had become a responsible young man who helped Margaret with household chores and protected Billy and Sarah like an older brother. Billy, at 10, was the joy of the house, always ready with a joke or a word of comfort. Sarah, at 12, had become an intelligent and compassionate young woman who dreamed of becoming a teacher. On a Sunday afternoon, while the family prepared to go to church, Margaret looked at her 3 grandchildren and felt deep gratitude. She had gone to that auction looking for purpose, and found much more than she expected. "You know," she said, adjusting Billy's shirt collar, "I thought I was saving you that day, but now I realize that you saved me." Tommy, who had grown a few inches and whose voice was beginning to deepen, smiled. "Grandma, you gave us a family. That's more than any of us ever dreamed of having." Margaret looked at the living room mirror, seeing the reflection of a 62-year-old woman surrounded by 3 children she loved more than life itself. Her hair was still gray, her hands were still calloused, but her blue eyes sparkled again with the joy she had lost so long ago. The story of Margaret Whitmore and her 3 grandchildren became legend in Cedar Falls. She proved that family isn't about perfection or appearance, but about love, acceptance, and determination. She showed that it's never too late to start over, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in ways we don't expect. Years later, when Tommy became an engineer, Billy opened his own restaurant, and Sarah became the town's most respected teacher. People still talked about that March afternoon when a 60-year-old woman bought 3 orphan children and discovered that one of them carried her family's name. Margaret lived to see her grandchildren marry and have children of their own. She died at 89, surrounded by a large and loving family that grew from an act of compassion and courage. If you made it this far, it's because, like Margaret, you believe that everyone deserves a chance to be loved. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart, and subscribe to discover more stories that show the best of humanity. Because sometimes, it's in the most unlikely moments that we find the family we've always been looking for.